I want to talk about a massive update in the war in Ukraine. Ukraine has been asking for almost a year now for long-range missiles that can go further than the HIMARS, further than artillery shells, further than the drone strikes, further than what is currently within their capability to strike Russian ammunition depots, to strike Russian logistics, and to strike Russian soldiers much deeper behind enemy lines in Crimea and in other locations, and possibly even destroy the Kerch Bridge, which we're going to talk about in a second. And they have primarily been making this request toward the United States because we have a lot of long-range missiles. We have technology that is like this that they have been wanting. But the United States has been holding back from delivering these long-range missiles out of a concern that the Ukrainians could use them on Russian territory, i.e. use them to strike Moscow or something like that, right? Something that they would say is not that strategically beneficial and could be considered a quote-unquote escalation. Now, I would point to the fact that the Ukrainians have already probably done strikes within Russian territory, whether it be train derailments or other operations that they've engaged in, attacks they've done in Belgorod. A lot of it, though, is a little bit more hazy because there's a lot of plausible deniability with things like train derailments. And when there's organizations like BOAK, which is an anarcho-communist anarchist group that is organized in Russia that is trying to undermine the war effort, they have more plausible deniability. They know other groups are doing this activity as well. Whereas in a long-range missile, there is no plausible deniability. If a long-range missile from Ukraine hits Moscow, there's only one group in the world that could have done that, and it would be the Ukrainians. So there is a little bit of a difference. So because of that fear, the United States has not delivered them long-range missiles. I would also point out that there is a political report about American and Chinese negotiations where we negotiated with the Chinese that they would not send weapons to Russia to support them, and they would discourage Russian military generals from following through on any threat to use a nuclear device from the Kremlin in response to, or if the United States does not deliver F-16, F-35 fighter jets to Ukraine, and does not deliver long-range missiles to Ukraine. And so these things all came together to motivate the United States not to send long-range missiles. But the United Kingdom never made an agreement like that. And the United Kingdom has a history in this war of being, a trailblazer. When it came to delivering tanks, the United States didn't want to send the Abrams. Germany didn't want to send any Panzers. They were scared that, again, it could be viewed as an escalation. What would the Russians do? And the British said, screw it. And they ended up sending Crusader tanks. And after they sent Crusader tanks, then the Germans sent tanks, then others sent tanks. And we're talking about modern Western battle tanks. We're not talking about the Polish sending T-72s and T-62s and old Soviet stockpiles. We're talking about modern Western tanks, many of which are of a better quality than what the Russians are fielding right now. And so they were a trailblazer. And once again, the British are being trailblazers in the delivery of long-range missiles. Why would they do this when there was considerations about escalation before? What has changed? It's hard to say exactly what has changed. I would put two guesses forward. The first guess is that the Ukrainians are trying to conduct a counteroffensive in the very near future, and having these longer range missiles could allow them to strike the Kerch Bridge, which is a major supply hub for Russian soldiers in Crimea and in the south of the country in areas like Kherson and Zaporozhye. And if they were able to destroy the Kerch Bridge, it would be much more difficult for the Russians to transport ammunition, tanks, artillery guns, artillery shells, soldiers, and all different types of equipment into the south of the country. And it would massively undermine Russian supply lines. This is why the Ukrainians targeted the Kerch Bridge before as well. Also, it would be an integral part of any Ukrainian operation to retake Crimea after retaking Zaporozhye and Kherson. So that's one motivator, I think. But another motivator is, I think the British are just happy to call the Russians bluff. Every single time there was this narrative put forward that if we were to give Ukraine X weapon, there would be a red line that was crossed. It would be an escalation that would lead to the Russians doing something terrible. And so, of course, the big thing everybody talks about is they might use nukes. And every single time, it hasn't happened. It didn't happen when it came to artillery. It didn't happen when it came to HIMARS. It didn't happen when it came to the tanks. And now they've made a determination that screw it. It seemed that every single other time we've called their bluff, nothing has happened. Let's do it again for something that the Ukrainians has desperately been asking for. And they're going to be delivering a weapon here, the Storm Shadow missile, which is something that the British don't even need those many of anyway. The British have only used the Storm Shadow missile, which is a long-range missile, which travels very low to the ground. It has anti-electronic warfare capabilities. It's very precise. It will blow a hole in the target and then explode after going through that hole in the target. It has been effective when they've used it in operations in the Middle East, but they've only used like 80 of them for the entirety of its service. It's a French and British designed weapon, and they had about over 1,000, so they have over 900 left, and they're currently trying to modernize, because this is a weapon from the 90s, actually, when it was designed by the French and the British. And so they're trying to modernize. They have a reserve of over 900 of them, so they've made a determination that they don't really need it anymore. They don't really need these, and so if they're trying to modernize, and they're going to be making supplemental purchases to get better quality long-range missiles, and the Ukrainians need long-range missiles. They need any type of long-range missiles, and these missiles have a range of about 250 kilometers, which would put basically the entirety of Russian-occupied Ukraine within range of the Ukrainians, meaning every Russian tank, every Russian position, every Russian base, every Russian ammo depot, every Russian logistical hub, every Russian railway is now within range of the Ukrainians, because this delivery has already been made. And it has a range of 250 kilometers roughly, which would put most, if not all, of Crimea in range as well. These vehicles are gigantic. These missiles are gigantic. They're about the size of a small car. They're about $2 million each. Let's look at some of the footage of this operating. This is from a flight, and this is from a test in 2000 during a year after the Afghanistan invasion. The thing is, like, I don't know how heavy it is, but it's a very big missile. The thing has a lot of punching power, not only because it blows a hole in its target and then explodes, meaning this can blast through concrete with ease. Again, perfect for destroying the Kerch Bridge that the Russians illegally put up to connect Russia to Crimea to further their occupation and the colonial objectives in Crimea. But it also is just gigantic. It's like the size of a small car. Man. It's a fast thing, and because of the fact that it travels so close to the ground, it's a very low flying missile. It also is very difficult to pick up on radar. Now, some people might say, this was developed in the 90s, so, other advancements have been made since that would make it easier to spot. While that's true, as this war has demonstrated, the Russians are using a lot of old equipment from the Soviet era. So I don't know how much of an issue that'll be. The breathing from the operator here is very creepy, I will say.
Stand by for impact. Stand by, stand by, stand by. Mark it.
Hit the target right on point. Again, extremely accurate. Let's read a little bit about this delivery, for any information that I might have missed. The United Kingdom has delivered multiple Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukraine, giving the nation a new long-range strike capability in advance of a highly anticipated counteroffensive against Russian forces, multiple senior Western officials told CNN. UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, calling the donation Ukraine's best chance to defend themselves against Russia's continued brutality, confirmed the transaction on Thursday after CNN exclusively reported the deal. The Storm Shadow is a long-range cruise missile with stealth capabilities jointly developed by the UK and France, with its typically launched from the air. With a firing range of an excess of 250 kilometers or 155 miles, it is just short of the 185-mile range capacity of the US-made surface-to-surface Army Tactical Missile System, or ATACMS, that Ukraine has been long asking for. Critically, the Storm Shadow has the range to strike deep into Russian-held territory in eastern Ukraine. A Western official told CNN that the UK received assurances from the Ukrainian government that these missiles will be used only within Ukrainian sovereign territory and not inside Russia. Now, I don't know if that's going to be the case. If it was extremely beneficial for them to strike within some territory, it could really undermine the Russians, maybe they would do it. The Ukrainians say they haven't done these types of operations before in Russia. We know that they almost certainly have. But then again, a lot of those are kind of blurry because they're drone attacks or they're this or they're that. And I'm not saying that the Moscow drone attack was done by them, but they're attacks that were probably done for them, and we don't really know for sure. And there's not going to be any blurriness if one of these missiles, which we now all know that Ukraine has, smacks into Moscow. The missile is a real game changer from a range perspective, a senior U.S. military official told CNN, and gives Kiev a capability it has been requesting since the outset of the war. As CNN has reported, Ukraine's current maximum range on U.S.-provided weapons is around 49 miles. So their maximum range before was 49 miles. Now it's 155. That's a massive jump, more than tripling their range. Of course, they only have so many of these. How many exactly, we don't know. But considering that the UK has over 900 of them in stockpile, and they don't really need them much anymore since they're modernizing, they could have a decent chunk of these ready to smack into the Kerch Bridge and other locations. The deployment of the missiles comes as Ukrainian forces prepare to launch a counteroffensive intended to retake Kremlin-held territory in eastern and southern parts of the country. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his country still needs a bit more time before it launches the counteroffensive in order to allow some of the more promised Western military aid to arrive in the country. With what we have, we can go forward and be successful, Zelensky told European public service broadcasters in an interview published on Thursday, but we'd lose a lot of people. I think that's unacceptable. So we need to wait. We still need a bit more time, he added. Among the supplies Ukraine is still waiting for are armored vehicles, including tanks, which Zelensky said were arriving in batches. This is not the first time Britain has gone further than the US in the weaponry it has been prepared to send Ukraine. It was the first ally to announce it was sending modern Western tanks to Ukraine in January, pledging 14 Challenger 2 tanks before the US announced it would contribute M1 Abrams tanks shortly after. We then contributed around 31 A1 Abrams. I know that there was a clip on Twitter of this being talked about. I want to see if we can find it. And I'm talking about the House of Commons, the British talking about it in the House of Commons. Do we have that footage of them talking about it? Here it is. I wanted to check it out. This is UK Defense Secretary Ben Wallace.
Today I can confirm that the UK is donating Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine. Storm Shadow is a long-range, conventional-only precision strike capability. It complements the long-range systems already gifted, including HIMARS and Harpoon missiles, as well as Ukraine's own Neptune cruise missile and longer-range missions elsewhere gifted. The donation of these weapon systems gives Ukraine the best chance to defend themselves against Russia's continued brutality, especially the deliberate targeting of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, which is against international law. Ukraine has a right to be able to defend itself against this. The use of Storm Shadow will allow Ukraine to push back Russian forces based within Ukrainian sovereign territory.
Now, there is some fear online I've seen in reaction to all this. And the fear is the same fear when we sent the artillery shells, when we sent the first weapon shipments, when we sent the tanks, when we've sent any of the other equipment that Ukraine has requested. And the fear is, it was also what originally people thought was they were very fearful of when Poland started to send MiG fighter jets. Oh my gosh, what are the Russians going to do? But every single time, the Russians don't do anything. And the reason the Russians don't do anything is because the Russians have already thrown everything they have, including the kitchen sink, at Ukraine. Every single time something happens, for example, like the drone explosion, which we don't know for sure was done by the Ukrainians, in Moscow. I saw someone like Ian Miles Chong and a bunch of others saying, oh my goodness, well, Ukraine's now going to bear the full brunt of Russian brutality. I saw something similar said on Breaking Points, the Hills program. What else could they do? What is Russia going to do? Is Russia going to invade Ukraine? Oh, maybe Russia will bomb Ukrainian civilians. We haven't seen that before. Maybe they'll fill up mass graves. Oh, wait, they've done all of these things and more. They specifically tried to target Ukrainian civilian infrastructure during the winter months, specifically their electricity, so they could freeze the Ukrainians into submission. What more could they do? What What am I missing here? What more could they do that they currently aren't doing? Ridiculous. Anyway, I'm happy to see that the British have done this. I think it makes sense for them to do it, considering they haven't done any of these negotiations with the Chinese. We don't know the status of whether those deals are still in place or not. But if the United States isn't going to do it, I'm happy the Britbongers do it. And oh my goodness, I can't believe I'm going to say it. Good job, Great Britain.